W nowej erze wierzymy, że poprzez ciekawość, chęć uczenia się i odwagę korzystania z wiedzy można zmieniać siebie i świat. Wierzymy w każdego, kto chce się rozwijać. Człowiek jest tym, czego miał odwagę się nauczyć. Kiedy szukasz kierunku, dajemy inspirację i rozbudzamy ciekawość. Kiedy potrzebujesz wiedzy, zapewniamy materiały i narzędzia do efektywnej i wciągającej nauki. Kiedy przychodzi czas, aby wiedza sprawdzała się w praktyce, wspieramy inicjatywy i pomysły. Każdy, kto poprzez wiedzę i naukę chce zmieniać swój świat, jest dla nas ważny. Dlatego dbamy o najmniejszy szczegół w naszej ofercie. Wierzymy, że codziennie możesz nauczyć się czegoś, co rozpocznie nową erę Twojego życia. Twoja nowa era.
Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of my Matura Perspectives. And today it's English in use, a rather fancy name for grammar and vocabulary. Also a term which is contradictory in nature, because there's a lot of English but not much use. The Polish term, the recognition of language structures, is much closer to the truth and much more relevant. And we're going to look at it from two different angles. Firstly, we're going to look at it from the perspective of the part of the exam, the part of Matura. And secondly, as it has a bearing on writing and speaking, we're going to look at use of English from the perspective of language production, especially in the light of appropriateness, accuracy and range. So let's flip the camera and see what's in it. The agenda for the webinar is as follows. I'm going to start off by trying to define what English in use is. I realize that most of us know what English in use actually is and boils down to, but having studied past exams, there might be some evidence which is interesting, if not illuminating. So we might actually need to redefine English in use in terms of the elements which are important, the elements which are problematic, and the elements which actually occur in this part of the exam. Then I'm going to look at English in use in Matura 2019, again trying to analyze it, trying to identify problem areas, which is going to be our next point. And I'll try to suggest different ways of overcoming those problems and difficulties, because we all want our students to do better than otherwise would. And finally, I'm going to try to extend English in use to writing and speaking. It's going to be just mentioned in passing. And this is because in one of the previous webinars, I was talking about speaking, I was talking about productive skills. And one of the aspects was focusing on accuracy, focusing on a range, focusing on complexity. So there's no point repeating those things. And probably English in use as the part itself is interesting enough to give it the whole webinar. If we look at English in use and if we compare it to the other three parts of the written exam, we notice that this part is definitely the hardest for the students, the most difficult and the most challenging. It probably is the shortest as well, just 10 items in 2 tasks. But it's all knowledge driven. Either the students know the answer or they don't know the answer. There's nothing in between. It's either or. There's no language choice. It's just a chain. So we've got the chain of structures, chain of grammatical structures and lexical structures, but the students are not really given a choice, as they are, for example, in production-based parts of the exam. And as a result, they cannot manipulate with language. Again, either they know the answer or they don't know the answer. There's nothing in between. Also, this part is not really strategy friendly. We can talk about different exam strategies, but we can't really talk about communication strategies. Again, either you know the answer or you don't know the answer. The strategies will not help you much in that. It is also characterized with a high degree of unpredictability. We simply don't know which aspects of language will be present at the exam. which aspects of grammar, which aspects of vocabulary, which lexical structures, which grammatical structures. It's very, very hard, if not impossible, to predict what is going to be important and what is going to be less important. So if we try to define English in use, if we try to see what is actually in it, it goes without saying that we've got grammar and we've got vocabulary. Two seemingly separate aspects of language, but I'll treat them as a continuum. So there will be grammar on the one hand, there will be vocabulary on the other hand, but there will be some things in between. So starting off with what I call mainstream grammar, which is the end of the continuum, at the grammar end. We've got tenses, we've got conditionals, we've got the passive, we've got modals, we've got indirect speech, we've got anything that we typically associate with grammar. We hear the word grammar, we immediately mean tenses or conditionals or the passive or whatever I have in this list. But then there's also peripheral grammar, and peripheral grammar, having studied past exams, it's mainly pronouns, the use of different pronouns, like each other, like personal pronouns versus there is, there are. So we're going to have a closer look at pronouns as well, because they seem to appear in exams, and then there's a chance that they might appear in the exam in the future. Then the next point in the continuum would be lexicogrammar, and lexicogrammar is something that puts grammar and vocabulary together. It's not individual words, but it's word patterns. And by word patterns, I mean that most of the words have that little grammars. Take the word let, for example. Knowing the word let would be knowing the meaning of the word, but also knowing that let does not go with the preposition to. And students often use the word to with let because it seems natural and correct for them. On the other hand, if you look at the word want, want goes with to. But then if we think of the word want in a slightly non-canonical sentence, we know that the object gets somehow in the way, and we end up with the sentence, I want her to visit me tomorrow, for example. So want her to instead of want that she does something. So that's lexicogrammar, that's those little grammars of words. Then the next aspect would be lexis, and here we've got collocations, here we've got expressions, we've got idioms. Then we have pure vocabulary or words, and here we're talking about meaning and word formation. And when we talk about meaning, again, in past exams, the analysis of past exams allows me to come up with a conclusion that usually when it comes to meanings, we have oppositions. For example, the word tell versus the word say versus the word speak. So it's not meaning per se, it's not defining the words, but it's being able to identify differences in meaning of similar words. And there's one aspect missing, the aspect that puts lexis and words together, and these would be textual devices. Textual devices would be those language items that make a text coherent, and these could be either individual words, so belonging to the words group, for example, instead, but they could belong to the lexis group or the expressions group, for example, such as, which is an idiomatic expression, we could say, and not a single word. And all those items, they comprise English in use, and they were present in the past exams in one way or the other. So if we try to use some color codes, we see that we've got vocabulary on the one end, grammar on the other end, and then we've got lexicogrammar that kind of puts them together. That is concerned with words, but also is concerned with the grammar which is inherent in these words. Now I would like to make some controversial claims which are based on the results of the Matura done in 2019, the last year's Matura. This controversial claim, or these controversial claims, they mainly amount to the fact that I don't believe in the effectiveness of what we call the final prep year. I think this syndrome is just no good. So if we look at the results, if we look at the four written parts of Matura, the slide or the graph you may be familiar with, we see that the average score was 64%, which is much lower than the average score for the whole exam, which was 72%, and much lower than the average score for the other three parts of the exam, so the hardest, as I was saying earlier. If we look at another graphic, we've got the results on the horizontal axis, and we've got the percentage of the candidates on the vertical axis. Again, this is something you might be familiar with if you visited the TKE website. I was also showing it in one of the previous webinars, but I'm going to analyze it in a slightly different way. I'm going to analyze it from the perspective of the final prep year syndrome, as I call it. So we remember that the average score for the whole exam was 72%, actually the number of students who scored 72% or more is 60%. So these would be our good and very good students, which leaves us with the remaining 40%, the group which is not uniform at all. Because within this group, we will have the students, 10% of them, who scored above the arbitrarily chosen level of 60%, but they scored less than 72, less than the average score for the whole exam, which leaves us with yet another group, the orange, I think it is, yellowish kind of orange group, the remaining 30% of the students, out of which 24% passed and 6 failed. And now when we think about leaving the preparation for the use of English part for just the final year, we know that the that the 60% of the students, those good and very good students, they can do it because they'll be just polishing their English. They'll be perhaps learning some nuances, but there will be not too many things which are new for them to learn. The average students, our 10% group, for them there will be something to learn, there will be something new, but still probably they will be able to manage the material in a year before Matura. But with the 24% group, here where the problems begin to appear. We've got the polishing group, we've got the learning group, our orange group will be called the hoping group. They will get some of the answers right, but then with the others, they can just hope that their wild guesses will be correct in some cases. Whereas the 6% group, the final year is just not enough, and I call them the praying group because that's what's left for them. Not really much they can learn if they were not able to learn the basics in 11 years before the final year in Matura. And if we look at the results of particular items in the use of English part, we've got the percentage values on the right. And again, what we observe is that the results are pretty low, from 53% for 9.3 to 63% in 8.3 and 9.2. So we've got 6 items which were below the 64% average score for this part. And we've got only 2 items, 75% and 81%, which is 8.4 and 9.1, which were above the average for the whole exam. So it's bad. And if we look at the two tasks from Matura, the first one is based on the text. We've got 5 gaps, we've got 3 options for each gap, and here are the correct answers. And let's just have a look at what types of tasks occur in this part and how well or how badly the students did in this part. So in 8.1 we've got taken, we've got seats, both free and taken. In 8.2 we've got each other, 2 seats next to each other, so we've got the pronoun I was referring to earlier. In 8.3 we've got the expression makes use of something, the existing CCTV cameras on the upper deck. 8.4 it's B, it's tell, and tell passengers the time to the next bus stop. And 8.5 is the passive voice. Passengers are informed about serious delays and or other problems. And now see our collocation, the seats which are taken but not busy or not engaged. The score for that was 54%, and we could call it collocation or knowledge, so this goes under the heading of lexicogrammar. In B, 69%, so not bad in the light of the results. Peripheral grammar, we've got our each other, so we've got our pronoun here. In A, 63%, so slightly below the average. We've got an idiomatic expression, makes use of, which can be deduced on the basis of the word use. Then in 8.4, 75%, so really high. Lexical opposition, say, tell, or speak. And 8.5, we've got the passive at a mere 56%. So a passive are informed is somehow problematic. Then if we move on to the next task, to the translation task, the task with the sentences, gapped sentences with some translation cues and 3 options for each cue. What we've got in there is we needn't blame ourselves for this mistake. She left the restaurant. Why don't you want her to talk? My parents didn't let me watch. And how much time did you spend with your cousin in London last summer? And again, the first one, ourselves, not really a problem, 81%. Then again, the pronoun, so the peripheral grammar. Then we've got she left the restaurant, 63% only. Probably the problem was she went out with the of missing. So again, we've got the example of lexicogrammar, the little grammar, knowing that the word leave goes without the preposition and go out goes with the preposition, at least in this linguistic context. Then we've got another example of little grammar, the pattern, the grammatical pattern of the word want, 53%. Then we've got another example of little grammar, let me watch, let without to, that's 60%. And then we've got the pure grammar, canonical grammar or mainstream grammar, the past tense, how much time did you spend, that was 64%, so that was the average. And if we look at the distribution of the item types from the last years and from the year before, from 2018. I wasn't looking at any previous ones to give you the comparison, because the Matura in 2017 looked slightly different. There was no translation elements in it. It was introduced in 2018, so that's why I'm comparing these two. What we see here is that problem areas are as follows. We've got vocabulary in 2019, collocation, and we've got vocabulary in 2018, also collocation. We've got passive in 2018, and we've got passive in 2019, both problematic. Then in 2019, in last year's Matura, also the lexicogrammar aspect presented a problem at 53%. But if we go further, and if we try to see which items were also problematic because the score for each of those items was below the average for the whole exam. We see that, and these are in green, we see that the majority of the items were problematic. Less of them in 2018 now. And if we look at some selected problem areas from the past exams, there were versus they were seems to be a problem. I know that the there is, there are, there was, there were construction is not present in Polish, and it somehow creates problems for the learners. The passive is something that students need to get more practice in. Strawberries are picked, strawberries are picking was often chosen. Instead, as a linking word, was also problematic. Collocations with less frequent words were problematic, like attend the event. Collocations with the lexical verbs were problematic, have somebody's attention. The lexical verbs would be verbs like have, make, take, those which occur more frequently in phrases and expressions than on their own, and the meaning changes as a result. Like in make the bed, you don't make the bed in the meaning of make as we typically use it, but it's more kind of idiomatic. And these are problematic for the learners. Word patterns are problematic. The let pattern, the want pattern, surprisingly enough or not, a very basic word, but in the construction with the object, want somebody to do something, students were choosing want that someone does something. And the passive. I was trying to think why the passive is problematic for the learners, and I think that because it doesn't make much sense from the perspective of meaning. It doesn't change much when it comes to meaning. But again, the bottom line is that the passive definitely needs more attention. And if we think of some pedagogic implications of how to overcome the problems, the first one that springs to mind is teach it the way you test it. So follow the backwash or follow the washback principle. We know that the first task is based on the text, but we also know that the text may be helpful or not when it comes to learners' performance. It may help or it may obstruct their performance. And it's because they may not really fully understand the text, or they may make the wrong use of contextual clues which appear in the text. Then if we look at the translation, which is the second part of English in use, we know that if it's not practice, it could be a serious obstacle, mainly from the cognitive perspective. So you have to think in terms of the second language, the foreign language, in terms of English, and suddenly you're forced to do a task where this switch to your mother tongue is mandatory. And the second important point, except for the backwash, teaching it the way we test it, it's practice, practice, practice. We know that with grammar, we know that with vocabulary, students have to practice a lot. The more the merrier, the more the better. Also, instead of practicing things in a mechanical, automatic fashion, we need to perform different kinds of task analyses just to make sure that the students are involved cognitively in the process. And that's what I would like to show you in the time that remains. So looking at different ideas, looking at different ways of going about problematic issues and helping students to straighten things out a little bit. So I'm going to start off this part by showing you some of the activities from my perspectives. We're going to look at them either as a basis for doing something more with the activities, or using them the way they are and just analysing what's in them and how the students can benefit from them. And the first one is called grammar practice. It's the gerund versus the infinitive. The students are given the sentences, and also they're given pairs of words. So we see that the activity is kind of complex linguistic. It doesn't give them just a word to fill in, but it gives them the whole pair of words to put in each sentence. As a result, it's also natural, and the main focus of this activity is lexicogrammar, so it's the patterns of words, of the words given, and what stems from it is the changes in meaning that a particular pattern may have. And also, what can be the outcome of that activity is the analysis. So this cognitive load, or focusing on the cognitive aspect of the activity, might be important for the students and might be beneficial for them as well. If we look at 10 and 9, we have got the word regret. We regret to inform you that you will not be accepted for a place at the college. Verses 10, it was a stupid thing to do, but I don't regret doing it because it was such good fun. So we've got regret with the infinitive in the first one, we've got regret in the gerund in the other one, and we want the students to tell us what kind of changes in meaning the use of the gerund or the use of the infinitive with the word regret brings forth. Another one is a translation activity, or the one with the translation bits, where, well, it's a typical exam activity, where the students have to translate the bits in the brackets in Polish, and they have to come up with a sentence that is coherent, that makes sense, that is correct, etc. And again, when I look at this activity, I immediately think of the possibilities of extending it. So here is where the grammar reference sections come into play. We could just ask them to read through those grammar reference sections in the book and focus on the example sentences which are given. Then use the sentences to compile the repository of translation bits. And to give you a flavour of what I mean, we've got the grammar reference section with ing and infinitive. You've got the reference on the left. It's not the whole page, but it's on the right, it's made bigger, it's blown up. What we've got there is that we've got the pattern forget plus ing. We've got the translation zapomnieć, co się zrobiło w przeszłości. We've got the sentence I'll never forget receiving my first job offer. I was so excited. Then we've got, for comparison, forget plus infinitive with to, and it's zapomnieć o zrobieniu czegoś w przyszłości. So we've got the past and the future. That's the difference for the learners. So we use those examples as some sort of basis, some sort of repository of those translation bits that could be used with the learners that we could reuse later just to see how well they've remembered the grammar reference section, and also to make sure that they do the grammar reference sections with enough attention. Looking at English in use, looking at exam practice and looking at my perspectives, the methodology of doing grammar is complex. I mean, there's lots of it in the first place. You remember that in one of the first slides I was saying that we've got to give the students a lot of grammar practice, and that's what my perspectives actually does. So we've got grammar 1. It's taken from one unit, okay? It's grammar 1. We've got the explanation. We've got the activities that follow. We've got 3 with a gapped text with 3 multiple choice options. Then we've got another text, this time with the correct form of the verb. It's going to be the text that we will look at in a moment. It's a text by Ania Lewandowska. So it might be potentially interesting for the learners. Then we've got grammar 2 with a different structure, and this is our ing and infinitive. The first one was present perfect and past simple. Then this is a bit more extended than grammar 1. We've got examples of batteries, a whole battery of different activities, some exam orientated and some not exam orientated. Then we move on to the skills review, where we've got the English in use part with word building, with grammar, with paraphrase, with some typical exam tasks. Then we move on to the grammar reference section with those translation bits I was telling you earlier. So we've got grammar reference 6, present perfect and past simple. So that was from grammar 1, where we've got the explanations and we've got the examples of language that could be used or reused later. And we've got grammar practice that follows, which again resembles the exam tasks for the students. So there's lots of it, and if done with due attention, then the results could be promising. So I was telling you we're going to look at the text about Ania Lewandowska. It's a gapped text that the students have to complete with the correct form of the verb in the box. Either past simple or present perfect continuous. So it's a grammar activity and not really an exam-orientated activity. So we could actually think about how to reprocess this text, how to make sure that the students get involved in it. So we start by asking the learners to do the activity the way it is in the book. So fill in the gaps with the words in the correct form, we check the answers, and then we might ask them to choose 5 fragments of the text, once they've done the text, 5 fragments of the text that could be gapped, that could be reused as the as task 8 from the exam. The gapped text with 5 gaps and 3 options for each gap. So we ask them to choose 5 fragments of the text that could be gapped. Then we ask them to think about 2 distractors for each gap, and we have to make sure that the distractors are not the incorrect forms, because that's what students often do. They just for distractors, they choose the forms that do not exist in English, and that is wrong, because you never have it in the exam. It's going to be something correct, but something that doesn't fit in the gap. And then you perform the task analysis with the learners. And when you think of the benefits for the learners, let's have a look at the potential gapped fragments of the text. Something I would probably use if I was a teacher. I would focus on used to be. I would focus on recognized as. I would focus at the age of something. Good at, gives advice, specializes in, including, unknown as. And now when we think of the benefits, what happens here is something I call reverse engineering. So we get the students to think of what potential candidates there might be for the gaps in the text. So we, from the perspective of exam taker, we get them to be exam makers, if that makes any sense to you. Yeah, so just reprocessing the text, analyzing the text, thinking very critically about what lends itself to be gapped and what doesn't lend itself to be gapped, and then try to think about the potential distractors for it. And the students don't have to do it as they typically do exam tasks or exam-like tasks. It doesn't matter. What matters is that they are analyzing the text. What matters is that they are trying to think about what might be potential candidates for the gaps. When it comes to text processing, we could use activities with paraphrasing. So we could try to think of tailoring the task or changing the task so it resembles the Matura Podstawowa use of English or English in use exam task. So again, we ask them to do the activity, we check the answers, we make sure that the answers are correct, and then we can ask them to identify potential translation bits in them. I've chosen wish, I've chosen conditionals because these are problematic, especially wish I think is problematic. I wish you were or I wish you weren't, which one is correct, which one means what, it's always a problem for the learners. And then we ask them to rewrite those sentences with the translated bits. For example, if we look at 3, I bought an expensive jacket so I didn't have enough money for a pair of jeans, and the keyword is hadn't. So if I hadn't bought an expensive jacket, I would have had money for a pair of jeans. And then the students rewrite the sentence for if I hadn't bought, gdybym nie kupiła. That's the Polish translation bit, that's the cue for them. And then we could collect them and use them later, just to see how well they remember what they had done before. And if we look at my perspectives, obviously we could tailor the activities, but also we could use the activities which are there. And I would like to draw your attention to the teacher's book, which has 90 pages of extra materials with exam tasks. I would like to show you some of them. 90 pages, that is a lot. You know, the more the merrier, I hope. So I'd like to show you just 6, I think, examples of such tasks from the teacher's books, those extras, starting off with equivalent words, where the students have to choose one option, one word or one phrase that resembles in meaning the phrase given in bold in the matrix sentence. So then play is efficient and able to adapt to changing situation. And obviously the word is flexible. So the focus is on meaning here. We try to look at what words could mean or whether a word or a phrase can be substituted with another one. And we've got words, we've got expressions, but also we've got word patterns. So we're looking at vocabulary, but also we're looking at lexicogrammar. And it could be the two-way analysis, and it could also be useful for the written part when we talk about range and when we talk about complexity of writing. Another one is word formation. So it's also focusing on the lexical or the word aspect of the English in use part, where we've got a text which is gapped, and the students have to choose the words and use the word in the correct form in each gap. More options than gaps to make it funnier for the learners. And the focus is on accuracy, but also the focus could be on text processing, where we could ask the learners to redo it the way we redid it, the one about Ania Lewandowska. Then the one called lexical pairs, which I find truly nice, challenging and stimulating. We've got 2 sentences, each of them with a gap, and we've got 3 words. The students have to choose a word that fits both gaps. So the focus is on meaning, but also the focus is on context. So it's like having a small text. I was telling you earlier that the text could be either helpful or could hinder the learner's performance. This type of activity helps them in being precise, and it helps them in making the context helpful when it comes to doing the activity. The next one is the multiple choice one. So these are just random examples. This focuses exactly on the exam skills, or it resembles the exam task. We've got text processing. So again, we've got we provide students with the practice that would be helpful when it comes to using text with certain lexical and grammatical structures. So we've got an example of text processing. We could also get them to reprocess the text, so something a bit more challenging, something that probably lends itself to matura rozszerzona more than matura podstawowa. But we've got a gap text, we have no options here, but we can get the students, while they've done it, we can get the students to think of the possible options. And finally, the translation ones, the translation bits, what I call it, which focus on exam skills, where this looks exactly like the one from the use of English part of the exam, where we just familiarize the students with how to deal with the language shift from English to Polish. And to finish off, we know that when it comes to English in use, I hope by now you agree with me that there's more to it than mere grammar and vocabulary, and that English in use, except for the focus and exam tasks, requires deep processing and analysis. Without it, it's going to be mechanical and it's going to be automatic. But automaticity is never the first stage. It should be the last stage. The first stage should be deep,
should be cognitive, should allow the learners to process and should allow the learners to analyze the language, then it's easier to remember, then it's easier to use or to be reused later. So automaticity, yes, but not at the beginning, but at the end. Reverse engineering, so it's reprocessing tasks, reprocessing text, or reprocessing language samples, and designing exam-like tasks by the learners would allow them for a deeper understanding of grammatical and lexical structures. And also it will familiarize them with the actual task types that they will have to confront themselves with at the exam. And lastly, and as importantly, learners need to go through thousands of examples to commit them to memory and make them automatic. And as I was showing you, if you decide to use my perspectives, the teacher's book will give you lots and lots of extra material to be used with the students. And in the course book, the grammar and vocabulary sections are really extensive and really providing students lots and lots of practice.
So thanks a lot for your attention, and as always before I go, the contact slide to Nova Era and the invitation to the final episode in the series devoted to TED Talks and how TED Talks can help you in preparing the students for the exam. So I'll see you there. Bye.